Hey everybody, happy Sunday. Decided to lecture outside today because it was such a pretty day and the rains had passed. I'm going to go ahead and talk to you about terrestrial ecology and some of the vocabulary before we get into the cycles. So just a couple of questions to think about as we go through the terrestrial unit is what ecology is, what happens to the energy in the ecosystem, what are soils and how are they formed, and what happens to that matter in the ecosystem. Some other ones, maybe what factors the Earth's climate, what are the major biomes that are going to be found, we'll talk about that later, and what are some of the anthropogenic influences. So when we kind of started on ecology, let me see if I can make this a little bit smaller. There we go. Ecology is the connection of nature. It's the study of those connections and those relationships. And we look at the relationships between an ecosystem, the anthropogenic relationships that factor in as well. And organisms can be classified in different species based on certain characteristics, as you know from biology. And looking at the ecology, the communities, they differ in types of the numbers of the species. And this is called species diversity. It also contains species richness, and that's how much of the abundance of those individuals that are available within that ecosystem. And we look at how spread out they are or within the abundance of those species, and that's called species evenness. Sometimes, however, there are some early warnings. Sometimes there's some smoke alarms. Sorry, that's my daughter. Sometimes there's some smoke alarms with regards to organisms in a species or in an ecosystem, and they can be a presence of or abundance of species. It could be lichens, for example. Lichens are an early indicator of a clean ecosystem. They're very, very fragile to pollution, so if they start to disappear, then we know that we may have some pollution. We also have, with regards to water pollution, we look at the bacteria called E. coli. We look at the coliform of bacteria presence in the water. So those are some indicators of certain type of problems that are happening within an ecosystem. Another one is amphibians. Amphibians, they're vanishing, but they serve as that indicator species because they have so many different parts. They can be easily distributed and looking at the different parts of their life cycle. And those may be an indicator of parasites, diseases, overhunting, even pollution. Some relationships or some vocabulary that we're going to talk about really quickly is keystone species. These are the major players. So they're going to be helping to sustain the environment, such as sea otters are a good keystone species. We learned about the wolf in Yellowstone from our film. And certain beetles. So they help maintain it. They're a key player. Some other major players might be elephants because they're going to be pushing over or breaking up trees, and therefore they're going to be helping the growth for other species to live. Some vocabulary that we need to get out of the way is population. Those are a group of individuals of the same species living in a particular area. You have a community, and those communities can consist of the populations of all those different species living in an area. When you have multiple different types of communities, you have an ecosystem, and those contain the abiotic as well as the biotic components that make up that area. Remember, you have biotic, which is going to be your living factors, components, such as microorganisms, you, me, those living components, bacteria, any type of organisms, even plants. And then you have your non-living, and that's going to be your abiotic. And those are more of your weather, rock, soil, water. They may have living components in them, but they are abiotic. The realm of ecology, you should be familiar with this, as you go from your organism. An organism, a whole bunch of organisms are going to make populations. The populations make communities. The communities make an ecosystem, and the ecosystem makes the biosphere. And this week we're going to try to create a closed biome or a closed biosphere to see how that goes. A habitat is where an organism or a population lives. For example, it could be a nest, it could be a forest, it could be a different part of a tree. So that is where that organism or that population lives, which is different than a niche. A niche can also be confused with a habitat, but the niche encompasses the habitat because it's the total way of life. It's the role of that species in an ecosystem. All the physical and the chemical, the biological and the abiotic components for that organism. And no two different species can can occupy the same niche at the same time. If there is, they're going to have some competition. Your predator is an organism that captures and feeds on all parts of another animal, such as a lion, and we'll get to that. Another type of predator, which can also be consistent of humans. They can be the top predator. Conversely, we have the prey, and that's the organism that is captured and serves as that source of food and energy for that predator. We talked about tragedy of the commons a bit. Tragedy of the commons plays a key component in the terrestrial ecosystem as well as everything, but it's just that common property or that resource. And most are potentially renewable, but we look at clean air, open ocean, it's fish, and how much are we taking away. Biomass in an ecosystem is that organic matter. By plants, it's a dry weight. So if we were to measure biomass, we would have to dry it out in order to take all the water out. And that energy from the food and garbage and the agricultural waste we can be used for electrical energy. Decomposition is very quick. It happens very quickly in tropical rainforests because you have so much moisture versus a desert where it's going to take a little bit more time to break down that material. And grasslands have the deepest and most nutrient-rich of all soils. One of the biggest biomes that you're going to want to pay attention to is the chaparral, and this is seen widely or numerous times on the AP exam. So if any one of those that you really don't understand, the one that you need to understand the most is the chaparral. And that decomposition of that plant and animal, it's going to die, and then it's going to break down all those components of that organism and then return those components to the soil, and we'll talk about the cycles in another lecture. Remember, for photosynthesis, you don't need to know that much. It's just as simple. It's not as detailed as AP biology. It's a simple carbon dioxide plus water and solar energy is going to yield that glucose and oxygen, and kind of know where it's from, so you need to know the processes and your inputs and outputs. Same with cellular respiration. We talked about GPP and NBP. That is the amount that's going of that in organic matter per unit of time. This picture also has come up on the exam as a multiple choice question and a FRQ, but we look at the abundance of those organisms where we have some few above and below your extremes, and that's that tolerance level. But what is the carrying capacity? And that's the maximum number of particular species in a given habitat in a certain type of time. And this is something that has been on the exam multiple times, so you'll probably see a multiple choice question exactly like this, where you have your number of individuals in a population versus time. Your A is going to represent your biotic potentials. What is the potential of the bios or those organisms in that ecosystem? B is going to show how the population can overshoot many times, and then it will die off, and it may overshoot again, and then die off to try to get to that plateau. Your D represents your linear growth here. Your C represents your logistic growth. And what logistic growth is called is it more of a S curve, as you can see here. You will have a little bit of exponential growth right here, as you can see here, just like an A, as we have the biotic potential, or also a J curve, which is representative of a exponential growth. In a S curve or logistic growth, you're going to have a little bit of that exponential growth time period, but then it's going to then taper off into what we hit is the E, or your carrying capacity, which is the maximum number of individuals that can be supported in that ecosystem. This is all overshoot, can also be called an overshoot, and then what's called a dieback. Remember the other different types of vocabulary? We have herbivores, carnivores, and omnivores. Herbivores are primarily consumers that eat producers. You have carnivores that eat primary consumers, and then we have third or higher level consumers or carnivores that eat carnivores. Then you have the yum-yum-yumnivores, and that's kind of like what we do, is we eat everything, nom-nom-nom-nomnivores. It's a joke, by the way. Remember your producers, some bacteria and green plants, they manufacture its own food called autotrophs. We also have a primary consumer called your herbivores. Secondary, and that's organisms that feed on primary consumers. Most animals, but some are plants. Venus flytrap is an example. You have your tertiary consumers. Animals feed on animal-eating animals. Example, hawks, lions, bass, and shark. And we have our quaternary, and that's animals that feed on tertiary consumers. Examples are human. Kind of getting back to, let's see, where did my other slide go? Let me go first to decomposers. Where do those lie in the food chain? Many of you were questioning that and challenging kind of to see where that would go. And that's where an organism is going to digest parts of dead organisms, cast off fragments, waste of living organisms. Examples are going to be bacteria and fungi. And we also have something called a detritivore versus a scavenger. A scavenger is going to scavenge and eat that dead material, where you have your detritivores or detritus, which is that dead matter. Those are going to be the insects that feed on waste or dead bodies. A good example is what you see here on the screen. But another example that we don't think of is bed bugs, which are kind of, everybody thinks that they're really, really gross, and to be honest, they are. But they feed off dead skin. So that would be considered a detritivore. Then we also have overexploitation. And this next slide is a bit graphic, but I wanted to show you kind of some things that are happening within our ecosystem. And this is where we're overexploiting. Animals are being wiped out completely. The biggest one that people aren't even thinking of is the down left right here, which is sharks. And the shark population is decreasing. And the reason why is because people are just killing them for their fins, for shark fin soup. And this is happening in China and Japan. We also have some other areas of Japan and China. I believe this one here is in Japan. And this is where they killed the sperm whale for its blubber. You have the Taiji, Japan, and we'll be watching a film for the aquatic ecosystem, and where it's the slaughter of the dolphins that happens every September, and they kill them as well. And then we have elephants. They kill many people we're finding to kill elephants just for their tusks, and they're slaughtering them as well. And then this is an infamous picture, but this is people go on hunts where they're not using their meat, they're just using it for sport. Kind of getting back to the cycle of everything, but all those components of the is going to then cycle, going from your abiotic and going to your producers, and that's going to feed into your producers because that's going to nurture and make those producers grow. Then our consumers are going to eat those producers. Then they die off, so it's a circle of life. Remember, some is going to be lost as heat. It's that 10% rule. It averages about 10%, but you will see, some of the energy efficiency is going to range between about 8 and 14, but normal is 10%, and that's what you're going to see on the exam. The other day we looked at food chains and food webs. You want to be able to analyze the food chain and the food web, looking at the arrows, and they're going from the producer to the consumer because it's an energy push. So you want to be able to roughly explain both in a terrestrial and an aquatic ecosystem, in an ecosystem, excuse me. So remember, here you have your solar energy. That's going to be feeding everything in that food chain or food web. It goes to the first trophic level, your second trophic level, third, and your fourth. And these are going to be your autotrophs, your producers, your primary consumers, secondary consumers, and then your tertiary consumers. And remember, we lose heat. And all are going to then kind of go down into your detritivores, which are your decomposers and your detritus feeders. Here's a different type of structure, and this is shows a decrease of the usable energy. This is called an energy pyramid. And as you can see, we have a whole bunch of energy here in the primary consumers, and then it starts to decrease as we go in the tertiary. So if we were to flip this picture and have this right here represent your primary producers, that's going to be a good indication that there's a huge problem in that ecosystem. Remember that it is in accordance with the second law of thermodynamics. Remember, it's decreasing or increasing the entropy or randomness, and we have that what's called the 10% rule. So these are the three different types of structures that you should be familiar with. We have our energy pyramid, we have our biomass pyramid, and we may have another type of pyramid which is looking at the heat that's being lost. And that's the ecological efficiency, and again, I can't stress enough, it's a 10% rule. And here that is. And this is why the top predators are few in number and vulnerable to extinction. And this is because there's not enough energy to go around, so they have to consume more. So here's just an example going from grain, steer to human. How would those arrows work? You can do that on your own. So if we look at two different kinds of organisms, such as lions and zebras, they're said to have a predator-prey relationship. And we did this cycle in class. So this one was the lynx and the hare. We have the moose and the wolf, and we've also, you guys did the one with the wolf and the deer as well. And right here, this is a good indicator that there may be some population control laws that need to be put in effect. But predators are usually going to kill the sick, the weak, or the aged, and this helps the rest of the prey have a greater access to the food supply. And it also increases your genetic stock. Before I end this, this lecture, I'm just going to go over the different types of interactions or relationships. And those first we talked about the predator-prey relationship, but we're going to go over parasitism, mutualism, and commensalism. And so you have seen over time many organisms start to evolve and adapt to different types of relationships. And when we look at that, how they evolve, that for competition or some different resources with other species, that's called resource partitioning. So your symbiosis, we have parasitism. That's going to be one species feeding off on another one, where the host, and by living in or on for a large portion of its life. Commensalism benefits one species but doesn't harm or help the other. And then mutualism, where both benefit. And I'll show you some examples. Lastly, you have parasites. This is where they're going to be sponging off each other and they hurt the host. So microorganisms are one, tapeworms are another. Some parasites live outside the host, fleas, ticks, mistletoe plants, some lampreys. We also seen some parasites that I've seen recently, to where it's a tapeworm. It's a certain type of black tapeworm, and it ingests or goes into or accesses the I think it's either a grasshopper or some type of other bug, and then it's going to tell that insect kind of what to do, and once it's finished, it will kill that organism, and then it leaves its host area. It's quite disgusting, but you can look that up on YouTube. So here's some examples. We have mutualism. That's a win-win relationship. So we have certain type of birds that will perch on your rhino, and that's to help clean the rhino. So they both win. They get food, and they kind of have a place to live. You have your Finding Nemo, where you're seeing anemones and your fish, and your clownfish. And you also have in the plant world, you're going to have these mycorrhizae type of cyanobacteria, and in the nitrogen cycle as well as other cycles, but mostly the nitrogen cycle, this is going to allow your plants to then uproot that nitrogen, because nitrogen cannot fix it by itself. It needs that bacteria in order to fix that nitrogen in order for plants to use it. So that bacteria kind of hang around on plants that have more of a surface area, not a taproot, but have more of a surface area, as you can see here. The bacteria then reproduce, help with the water absorption, and fix that bacteria. So here's an example of mutualism. Commensalism is that is using without harming. Some species interact with the way that helps a species with little or no effect on the other. So here's an example with the plan. And another one might be a lamprey and a shark. Or excuse me, not a lamprey, a remora and a shark. When we look at these types of relationships, we're going to find that there might be some limited resources. And a population can only grow until competition for those limited resources is going to increase until the carrying capacity is reached. So some of those limited resources are going to be water, food, space, etc. Some of the typical phases in your cycle of population control, you might have an overshoot of the carrying capacity, like we talked about before, and this is because of reproductive time lag. We may have an increase in birth rates, and then you have that period required for that birth rate to then fall and that death rate to rise again. That population is going to crash, or it's going to have what's called a dieback until that carrying capacity is reached. And this other one might have infectious diseases start happening if that population cannot be controlled. An example is the bubonic plague. So your habitat is going to need cover, shelter, trees, shrubs, water, nutrients, macronutrients as well as micronutrients. So our macronutrients are your carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, nitrogen, calcium, and iron. You need to memorize these macronutrients, and this is going to help those populations live, grow, and reproduce. Then you have micronutrients who are only needed in small or trace amounts, and that's sodium, zinc, copper, chlorine, and iodine. And I'm going to stop here, and then we'll go through the cycles. Have a great day.